program, or HCV portability, our primary reference for this, of course, is the United States Housing Act of 1937. Some of you may know that Section 80 of the Act is the section that gives us the Housing Choice Voucher Program, but the actual section that covers portability is under Section 8R. The primary regulations are under 24 CFR 982.354 and 982.355. But I should alert you that there are various other places within Section 982 describing the Section 8 program where portability is discussed, so be aware of that. What I'm going to cover today is principally going to be coming from PIH Notice 2016-09 HA. Hopefully you all have a copy of that. That is the most recent notice that we have covering the total portability process. The regulations are the formal regulatory process, but the PIH notice goes into a lot more detail about what PHAs do, what tenants do, and so on. And I did mention one other reference here. This is HCV portability final rule. This was published in the Federal Register on September 1st, 2015. I don't know that you really need to address this. I think that there are some provisions of this that cover portability and VASH that may not be covered in the regulations, but for the most part, your best guide for portability is going to be PIH Notice 2016-09. So one of the main things about the HCV program, so a key feature of it is the fact that it's a program designed to be mobile. It is enabled to allow families the ability and opportunity to move with opportunity. So portability is a really essential part of how the HCV program works. Families may move to address to take advantage of different opportunities within a PHA's jurisdiction, or if they go out of the PHA's jurisdiction, that would be portability. And I'm going to move something here so I can see my information. So portability, okay, the term portability essentially refers to the process of leasing a dwelling unit with a tenant-based HCV voucher in the jurisdiction of a PHA that is different than the PHA that issues the voucher, okay? I'm gonna get into this in a second, but the PHA that issues the voucher is the PHA, is what we call the initial PHA. The PHA that receives the voucher in the other jurisdiction is what we call the receiving PHA. The receiving PHA may choose to either absorb or bill. We also call bill administering a voucher. I'm going to get into more detail about what that actually means. I'm going to do something here real quick. I'm having a hard time getting my screen to advance, so give me just a second here. Okay, so I want to cover some definitions here because we're going to be using this throughout the presentation. So we talked about the initial PHA. The initial PHA is the PHA that issues the voucher to the family prior to the family porting to a receiving PHA's jurisdiction. And obviously the receiving PHA is the PHA outside the initial PHA's jurisdiction where the family is choosing to move. Of course, we call that porting assistance. Another term that we're going to cover just a little bit is subsidy standards. Subsidy standards are PHA's policies for what size family for determining what size family qualifies for what size voucher. And one important point about this is that the receiving PHA's subsidy standards may be different than some issues. We'll talk about that a little bit later. We're going to talk a little bit about income eligible. Upon admission under the HCV program, a family must be income eligible. For a resident applicant, I'll define that in a minute. For a resident applicant who chooses to port, the family must be income eligible in the receiving PHA's jurisdiction. Income eligibility for income eligibility is not redetermined for families receiving assistance in the initial PHA's jurisdiction. I'm going to get into defining what those actually mean here in a second. And I am having problems with my presentation. Okay. Another definition that we're going to come across is higher cost unit. This is a unit that requires a higher subsidy amount due to an increase in gross rent for the unit. Now, this is not a term that is specific to portability, It can be used in reference to portability, but this term is also used for moves to another unit within a PHA's jurisdiction. A higher cost area is an area where a PHA would have to pay higher subsidy due to a higher payment standard or more generous subsidy standards of the receiving PHA. This is more specific to a portability situation. One example of this might be a case in which a receiving PHA issues a 3-bedroom voucher to a family that would have received a 2-bedroom voucher or did receive a 2-bedroom voucher in the initial PHA's jurisdiction. One thing to emphasize here is that a PHA may not deny a request to move due to insufficient funding if the area the family has selected is not a higher cost area. And we're going to talk a little bit later on about denials due to insufficient funding. So here I'm going to talk about absorbing versus or administering a voucher versus absorbing a voucher. Okay, so it is the initial PHA that issues the voucher. The receiving PHA is a PHA that accepts the family. This is the PHA where the family is choosing to move. The receiving PHA, and this is the receiving PHA's option, the receiving PHA chooses whether to administer a voucher or to absorb a voucher. In a case where the receiving PHA decides to administer a voucher, what that means, let me take care of this real quick. The receiving PHA administers assistance, which means that the receiving PHA conducts reexaminations, conducts HQS inspections, does the submitting of 505(h)s to PIC, but the receiving PHA bills the initial PHA for HAP expenditures and a portion of the administrative fee. In an administering sense or administering situation, the family remains a participant in the initial PHA's program, but the receiving PHA is administering the voucher for the initial PHA. If a receiving PHA absorbs a voucher, the receiving PHA assumes all responsibilities for administering the family's assistance, including the use of its own authority. The family's relationship to the initial PHA comes to an end. So a family essentially becomes a participant in the receiving PHA's jurisdiction. Okay. Hopefully I have everybody understands. If you have any questions, please let me know. And okay, so I want to talk a little bit about resident versus non-resident applicants. This is an issue that does come up sometimes, and it can be confusing for some PHAs. So a resident applicant, this is the family who had domicile or residency within the initial PHA's jurisdiction for at least 12 months prior to the date of application. A resident family selected from the waiting list may choose support immediately without having leased a unit in the initial PHA's jurisdiction. So the point is here that if you have a family that applies for assistance at a PHA, that family has lived in that jurisdiction for a while, that family has the right not to lease up in the initial PHA's jurisdiction. That family can go ahead and port to another area. So to give you an example here in Texas, if you have a PHA that leased up, comes up off the waiting list in, let's say, Houston, that person may decide they wants to move to Oregon right off the bat. Doesn't even lease up in the initial PHA's jurisdiction. The case is a little bit different for a non-resident applicant. This is a family that did not have domicile or residency within the initial PHA's jurisdiction for at least 12 months prior to application. In this case, a resident, I'm sorry, that should say non-resident. A non-resident family does not have the right to port during the first 12 months of assistance. Okay, the family must receive assistance in the initial PHA's jurisdiction for at least 12 months prior to porting. Now, the initial PHA may waive this requirement. One possible reason for doing that would be as a means of providing reasonable accommodation. Just to give you an example, I dealt with a case here a few years ago with was a lady who had applied for assistance. Between the time that she applied and the time that her application came up, that she was selected off the waiting list, she was diagnosed with cancer and needed to do treatment in another community. So in that case, she made a request for a reasonable accommodation, and the PHA acknowledged that request and allowed her to move, even though she had not lived in the initial PHA's jurisdiction for at least 12 months. So this slide is about fair housing requirements. I don't want to go into this in too much detail, but I should let you know that the PIH notice that I provided you goes into quite a bit of detail about fair housing requirements, so it's important to be aware of them. You all probably aware that you must manage your HCD program in compliance with fair housing laws. That includes Fair Housing Act, Civil Rights Act, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, Americans with Disabilities Act, and HUD's Equal Access Rule. If you want more information about exactly what that means, like I said, the notice goes into a little bit more detail. The notice also talks about the importance of considering reasonable accommodation requests in order to assure that a person with a disability is afforded a reasonable accommodations if it is necessary for that person to participate in the program. Okay. And one last thing is that PHAs must make their communications and written materials available in appropriate language to ensure that persons with limited English proficiency, LEP, have a reasonable means of being able to participate in the program. Again, I don't want to go into too much detail about this, but the notice dedicates at least 2 or 3 pages to this topic. So, family briefing. When a family is first selected to participate in the HCD program, the regulations require that the PHA give the family an oral briefing and an information package that covers the following topics. Now, keep in mind that this is for regular HCD assistance, so this is not necessarily specifically related to portability. One of the things that the packet must provide is information about how portability works. Generally, how the process works. It must advise participants or families about the possibility of differences in policies between the initial PHA and the receiving PHA. So it's really important to make sure that whatever packet of information you provide your PHAs contains this information. Another thing that the another information that needs to be provided is the advantages of moving into areas with low concentration of low-income families. Over the years, HUD realized that families are more successful when they move into areas of low concentration. And it's one of the reasons why mobility is such a key important part of the HCD program. So you want to make sure that you provide that information to your tenants. You want to provide information regarding selecting a unit. Some tenants are going to be much more familiar with the process than others. You want to make sure that they understand exactly what the process is, including the importance of returning a request for tenancy approval and so on. Again, these are not specific to portability. May involve portability or may involve someone just coming on a PHA's waiting list and residing in that PHA's jurisdiction. You want to cover voucher terms and extensions, how they work. When is the voucher going to expire? If it is extended, under what circumstances is the voucher extended, and when will it be extended? And finally, and this is really, really important, you want to make sure that you provide a list of landlords known to accept vouchers and any other resources that may be helpful to your tenants. Like I said, tenants are sometimes going to have difficulties with the portability process, and you want to give them as much information as necessary to kind of help them. If you have information about landlords that frequently accept Section 8 participants, that could be a really key help to them in leasing a unit. Okay, so another important concept to remember about vouchers is that during the initial or extended term of voucher, the family submission of the request for tenancy approval, and this is HUD Form 52517, to the PHA, suspends the term of the voucher until the PHA notifies the family in writing whether assisted tenancy has been approved or denied. In other words, it stops the clock when the voucher expires, pending the PHA's approval or disapproval of the unit. So to give you an example here, let's say that you have a family that has a voucher that is 60 days. Family turns in the request for tenancy approval on the 58th day. Well, that suspends the voucher. So the PHA may take another 10, 15 days in order to coordinate all activities. But that doesn't matter. Even though that 60-day period of time has passed since the family's initial voucher was issued, that voucher term is expired, and the the PHA must honor that request for tenancy approval and that family's choice of that unit um, until making a decision to approve or disapprove. And voucher suspension, like some of the other things we talked about, that's not specific necessarily to portability. That involves anybody who has received a voucher and submitted a request for tenancy approval. And just to let you know that the form 52517, the request for tenancy approval, this is something that the landlord fills out. It provides information to the PHA regarding the location of the unit, type of unit, what the proposed rent of the unit is, what the size of the unit is, who pays utilities. And there's some information about, there's a certification on there for landlords that own other properties regarding rent reasonableness of the HCD unit that's being rented or proposed in comparison to other unassisted units. So hopefully you all know what that is. Now we're going to get into denying requests to move. Okay, so we have mandatory denials. This is when a PHA denies requests because the family is not income eligible in receiving PHA's jurisdiction, or the family moves out of the current unit in violation of the lease, etc. Okay. Discretionary details include things such as the family's failure to meet family obligations under the program, or maybe the request does not comply with PHA's policies on timing and frequency of moves. In most cases, PHAs have a policy of no more than one move per calendar year. So if you have a family that's trying to move a second or a third time, or trying to port a second or third time, that would be a authorized reason to deny. And of course, we have denial for insufficient funding. The PHA has insufficient funding for continued assistance in accordance with regulations. I'm going to get into a little bit more detail, and this is going to be a really key area to keep in mind with portability. I do want to make one word about VAWA. I'm going to back up here real quick. I talked here about mandatory denials, and of course, one is here is family moves out of the current unit in violation of the lease. Under VAWA, there is actually an exception to this. And this is a case in which a family is permitted to move in violation of the lease if that situation involves the safety of the family due to a member of the family being a victim of domestic violence, dating violence, stalking, and that person believes that there is a legitimate or imminent threat to harm. This applies only, though, if the family is not in violation of other lease provisions. So just be aware that that families, under certain circumstances, if they move out because of domestic violence, dating violence, or stalking, as long as they're not in violation of other provisions of their lease, and it is something that invokes the VAWA requirement, they may be allowed to do that. I should mention that the state of Texas, if I remember correctly, also has some laws about that run along these lines to a certain degree. Okay. So denying portability for insufficient funding. Okay. A PHA may deny a family's request to port due to insufficient funding only if all of the following are true. Okay. One is that the move is to a higher cost unit. Of course, higher cost unit, we're generally referring to a move within a PHA's jurisdiction, or to a higher cost unit, or to a higher cost area, in which case we're really referring to a situation in another PHA's jurisdiction, which involves portability. Okay, the receiving PHA is not absorbing the voucher. This is applicable only to portability moves, and the PHA would be unable to avoid termination of current participants during the current calendar year in order to remain within its budgetary allocation. This includes any available HAP reserves for assistance payments. So the point is here that all of these requirements must be met in order to deny for insufficient funding. There are some prohibited denials due to insufficient funding. PHA may not deny a family request to move under portability if the receiving PHA has confirmed that it will absorb the family into its programs. If the receiving PHA is going to absorb the family, there will be no costs incurred by the initial PHA. So there should be no reason why that would be denied because of insufficient funding. Another reason is that a PHA must not deny moves for families within a PHA's jurisdiction, even if the new unit is a higher cost unit, if the family must move from its current unit. Some common reasons for this might be that the unit failed inspection, or the owner failed to renew the lease, or the owner chose not to renew the lease. If the family has already moved out of the unit, the PHA kind of has to honor that move, even if it is to a higher cost unit. And finally, a PHA may not deny a family's request to move due to insufficient funding because it wishes to admit additional families from its waiting list, regardless of whether it has unit months available to do so or not. Let me go back here real quick. One important requirement in making the decision to deny because of insufficient funding is a notice to the local field office. So the regulations require that a PHA provide the local PIH office notice within 10 days of the date that it determines that it's necessary to deny moves due to insufficient funding. Only one notification per year is required, and it must include the following. It must include a financial analysis that demonstrates why or how the PHA is projecting that that does not have the funding necessary to allow someone to port during the current calendar year. There must also be a statement that the PHA has ceased issuing vouchers and will not admit families from its waiting list until the limitation on moves is no longer in place. I think I should have put no longer in place. I may have messed up the wording there a little bit. And finally, a copy of the PHA's policy stating how the PHA will address families who have been denied moves. On this last one, it is really kind of important to emphasize that when you deny a family the opportunity to move under portability, it means a couple things. First, it means that you cannot admit any other families off of your waiting list. Because you're essentially making a statement that you can't allow a family to move under portability because you would have to terminate assistance for other families. If that's the case, you really can't admit anybody from your waiting list. The other thing that it means is that for the family that was denied, it essentially means that there is depending on the approval of the field office, it essentially means that there is a delay in allowing the family to move. So if a PHA denies a family the opportunity to move under portability because of insufficient funding, that PHA will have to give that family an opportunity to move later on when the funding becomes available. And that would be before that PHA starts to admit other applicants from its waiting list. Okay, I get everybody on that? Hopefully so. If you have any questions, please let me know. And hopefully I'm not moving too quickly on this. If you have any questions, I'm happy to discuss those with you. So frequently when we talk about portability, we also talk about shortfall. The PHA at risk for shortfall are generally referred to our shortfall prevention team, which will work with PHAs to develop it and implement strategies to minimize expenses and eventually help the PHA to come out of the shortfall situation. HUD may frequently require the following actions. It may require that the shortfall PHA stop permitting portability requests to higher cost units or higher cost areas in the receiving PHA's jurisdiction, unless the receiving PHA is absorbing the voucher. HUD might also, under some very rare circumstances, HUD might require a PHA to absorb a voucher of a family because the initial PHA is in a shortfall situation. So in this case, if the initial PHA is in a shortfall situation, while normally the receiving PHA would have the option of administering or absorbing a voucher, HUD might require the receiving PHA to absorb. I don't know that I've ever actually seen that happen. So I think that we don't generally take that step unless it's a really serious situation. So I want to talk about the Family Portability Information Form. This is the HUD 52665. During the portability process, both PHAs, receiving and initial and receiving PHAs, will be using this form to communicate back and forth with each other. The initial PHA will complete part 1 of the form and send it to the receiving PHA, along with a number of other documents. That would include a copy of the voucher that is signed by both the PHA and the family, a copy of the family's 5058. In some cases, we're talking about a non-resident family that never leased up the initial PHA's jurisdiction. There won't be a normal 5058. The initial PHA will have to send the voucher issuance. And I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a little bit. Other documents that the initial PHA may send to the receiving PHA will be the EIV report that's available, and any other pertinent information, which may include verification information supporting the income determined by the initial PHA. The receiving PHA will complete parts 2A and 2B of the form and return it to the initial PHA. The receiving PHA will also update part 2B as billing information changes. What I'm going to do really quick is I'm going to break from my presentation here, and I'm going to pull a copy of the form just to show you what it looks like. And let me take care of that so I can see the screen. So this is the Family Portability Information Form. This particular version expires in 2022. So I want to make sure I got the most recent version of this. So under this form, under part 1 here, the initial PHA will include this information. So it's going to include information regarding the family, the head of household, social security number. If the initial PHA uses some kind of a numbering system for vouchers, that can be put here. The initial PHA will put the bedroom size, issuance date, expiration date, and last income examination. There's a couple other questions that the initial PHA will put here. And then it makes a certification down here. This right here will include information about the certifying official at the initial PHA so that the receiving PHA knows who to contact. And we're going to come back to the second part of this here. This is part 2. So upon arriving at the receiving PHA's jurisdiction, the receiving PHA is going to issue that family a voucher. Okay, I'll talk about that again in a minute. So the receiving PHA will fill this information. And some of it is a repeat, but so the family's name here, family social security number, head of household, the voucher size. Now this may be different than the voucher size issued by the initial PHA. If the receiving PHA uses some kind of a numbering system for the HAP contract, that can be put here. And here is a section for the receiving PHA's administrative fee rate. And we'll talk about that as well a little later. This is the name of the certifying official for the receiving PHA. This will allow the initial PHA to know who the main contact is at the receiving PHA. Of course, as we get down here, part 2B, we kind of get into specifics about the family leasing in a specific unit. So under this section, it asks for a number of pieces of information, including the date that the HAP contract was executed. And it will provide some other information here. It'll cover whether or not the receiving PHA is going to administer or absorb the voucher. And one thing to remember about this second part is that anytime that there is a change in billing at the receiving PHA will have to complete this form. Now, if the receiving PHA absorbs the voucher, this form will never be used again. The family will become a participant in the receiving PHA's jurisdiction, and the relationship with the initial PHA comes to an end. Okay. So I'm going to go back to my presentation, and let me set this up so it's full screen. Okay, so we just covered this. So the regulations require that PHAs use some form of confirmed delivery method for communications in the portability process. This is for both the initial and receiving PHAs. Now, HUD supports the use of email as a preferred method of communication, but other methods may be used. The methods that I can think of mainly would be certified mail, which has become much less frequent over the last several years. and possibly fax receipts. These would be faxes that give the initial or receiving PHA a receipt that confirms that the fax was received. The initial PHA, before sending any information to the receiving PHA, must have a signed HUD 9886 on file. This is the authorization for release of information under the Privacy Act. Keep in mind that these forms, they're only good for 15 months. So when a family signs a form, all adult members must sign the form. And the time that that form is signed, that form is only good for 15 months. My general recommendation to PHA is that it runs for 15 months, but you might as well have families re-sign it every year at annual examination. That way you're never having to worry about whether the form is updated or not. And one other really important thing to keep in mind is that we're all about making sure that we protect personally identifiable information. It's kind of hard to say. We call it PII for short. So if you're an initial or receiving PHA sending information to the other PHA by email, you must assure that that information, any information such as social security numbers, birth dates, income information, any medical information, I don't know why that might be present in the portability notice, might be present because of some kind of a reasonable accommodation that was provided by the initial PHA. You got to make sure that your email is encrypted. Unfortunately, we live in a world where email messages, no matter how much we think that it's safe, sometimes those emails can be intercepted by people who misuse that information. Want to cover some initial PHA processing responsibilities. Upon receiving a request from a family to port to another PHA's jurisdiction, there are some things that the initial PHA must do. One thing is determined that the family is eligible to port. Okay. One example would be, let's say you have a family. This is a family that just came off the waiting list, and that family is a non-resident applicant. That family doesn't have the right to port right off the bat. So, the initial PHA may decide, well, you're not eligible to port because you're not eligible at the current time. Determine eligibility to move. Now, this sounds kind of similar to this top one here, but this might refer to a situation such as, let's say we have a family that's in mid-cycle with a lease, and under the lease, the family can't break the lease and is not willing to pay a reletting charge. A lot of leases contain reletting clauses that say, well, if you break the lease, you must pay this fee. I have seen a few leases that didn't provide any kind of release or reletting clause. So it essentially binds that tenant to that lease for the full term of the lease with no option to leave. I generally advise tenants not to sign those kind of leases. You never know when an accident might occur. Selecting the receiving PHA. This is something that is really going to be more of a collaborative effort between the tenant and the initial PHA. The tenant has the right to choose which PHA. If the tenant is moving to a certain area, I give you an example here in the Dallas area where I work. Dallas and Fort Worth are kind of together. We have probably about 7 or 8 PHAs that provide overlapping assistance. So anybody who's porting to the Dallas Fort Worth area could potentially lease up with any number of agencies in the area. The initial PHA needs to be able to assist the family in leasing unit. Oops, I keep on doing that. Sorry about that. Another thing that the initial PHA needs to do is to contact the receiving PHA. Okay. Even if you advise and encourage a family that is porting to a receiving PHA's jurisdiction to contact that PHA individually, the initial PHA still needs to contact the family. Still needs to contact that receiving PHA to inform the folks there to expect the family. And obviously, the initial PHA needs to issue a voucher to the family. Okay. A couple other things that will happen. The initial PHA needs to advise the family on how to contact the receiving PHA. I've already mentioned that the initial PHA needs to inform the receiving PHA to expect the family. And of course, we talked about this before, it is a responsibility of initial PHA to provide certain documents. Obviously, that's going to include the family portability form, which I just showed you. It's going to include the 5058, which is the family record, all verification forms. It's important that a copy of the voucher signed by both the initial PHA representative and the family be in that package of documents sent to initial PHA, or sent to the receiving PHA. The receiving PHA has a number of responsibilities as well. So the receiving PHA is required to provide assistance to family, obviously. Receiving PHA may either bill or absorb the family, so we've already talked about that. The receiving PHA has the right to rescreen participants under the receiving PHA's policies, and can deny the rights, can deny or terminate assistance. That's important to remember. So for instance, if you have, let's say we have a case in which an initial PHA forwards a family to the receiving PHA's jurisdiction, and that family does not meet the receiving PHA's income eligibility requirements. Well, the receiving PHA can deny the receipt of that family. Or another possible example might be that the family has a criminal history that wasn't an issue at the initial PHA, but the receiving PHA has a policy to deny participants that have certain criminal history records or criminal histories that have occurred within a certain period of time. Another thing to remember, I talked about denying portability in, but while a family is receiving assistance in the receiving PHA's jurisdiction, the receiving PHA also has the right to terminate assistance for, let's say the family violates the lease or violates program rules. So keep that in mind. We talked about this a little bit earlier. I showed you the portability form. Receiving PHA will complete parts 2A and 2B of the form and return the initial PHA. Every time that there is some kind of a change to the billing, or if there's a change in unit, sometimes a family may move within the receiving PHA's jurisdiction. The receiving PHA must inform the initial PHA, and part of doing that is sending this Part B form back. It is the receiving PHA's responsibility to determine the voucher size in its jurisdiction using its own subsidy standards. The voucher size in the receiving PHA's jurisdiction, according with its subsidy standards, may be different than the initial PHA's voucher size. And of course, the receiving PHA is going to issue a voucher to the family. Now, this might sound a little strange that during a portability process, the family is essentially issued a voucher twice, once by the initial PHA and then again by the receiving PHA. One thing to keep in mind about the voucher issued by the receiving PHA, it must not expire before 30 calendar days from the expiration date or the extended expiration date of the initial PHA's voucher. And I am kind of nearing the end of the presentation, so I'm going to open it up for questions here in a minute. There are a few other receiving PHA processing responsibilities. One is to conduct the initial HQS inspection. I didn't list it here, but it would also mean doing annual HQS inspections and family requested HQS inspections, or even owner requested HQS inspections. That's a little bit more rare, but those do happen. The receiving PHA will also evaluate any owner proposed requests for rent increases to make sure that those requests are reasonable. So it would be the receiving PHA that will evaluate those and either approve or deny them. And of course, the receiving PHA grants voucher extensions. Do I have any questions at the moment? Okay, I think everybody is really quiet, so I'm going to keep on going. Okay, so once the family leases up in the receiving PHA's jurisdiction, the receiving PHA is going to have a number of ongoing responsibilities. Okay, I think I've already mentioned some of these, but receiving PHA will have to conduct annual examinations and interim examinations as necessary. We'll also have to process any unit changes within the receiving PHA's jurisdiction. The receiving PHA will conduct HQS inspections at least every year. And at other interim times when they are necessary. It is the receiving PHA that will update the 5058 in PIC. If we're dealing with a special purpose voucher, such as a VASH voucher, so we have a family that ports from one VASH jurisdiction to another VASH jurisdiction, the receiving PHA is required to maintain any kind of special purpose codes used under 2N of the 5058. And I do want to highlight that under Section 12 of the 5058 for the HCV program, there are some fields that pertain specifically to portability. Regarding, for instance, the PHA code for the PHA that is being billed and how much is being billed. That will be captured in the 5058. Obviously, the receiving PHA is going to pay HAP to owners or to the owner. I've already covered this, a little bit redundant here, but the receiving PHA will approve or review and approve or deny any rent increase requests, updates the portability form, and issue vouchers for moves within the receiving PHA's jurisdiction. Okay, so I want to talk about some specific situations. So let's say we have a case in which the family's voucher for the initial PHA expires. What this means essentially is that when the family gets to the receiving PHA's jurisdiction, the initial PHA's voucher has already expired. So if this happens, the receiving PHA must contact the initial PHA to determine whether it will extend the voucher. If so, then the receiving PHA can move forward with the portability process. If not, then the family gets referred back to initial PHA's jurisdiction. Voucher extensions. I talked a little bit about this just a few minutes ago. The receiving PHA may subsequently extend its own voucher term. If it does, those voucher extensions are only valid for the family search within the receiving PHA's jurisdiction. The receiving PHA is also required by regulation to inform the initial PHA of any extension of the voucher term. And of course, finally, if a family in a receiving PHA's jurisdiction decides to port, the receiving PHA does not issue a voucher to the family under a billing arrangement that decides to move. Instead, the receiving PHA is going to refer that family back to the initial PHA's jurisdiction, and that initial PHA will issue a voucher to the family. Okay. I want to mention one other thing. We've talked a lot about initial and receiving PHA. Now, that process begins once the initial PHA issues a voucher to the family, and the family takes that voucher and goes to receiving PHA's jurisdiction. We will continue to use those terms as long as the receiving PHA continues to administer the voucher. If the receiving PHA absorbs that voucher, the whole concept of initial and receiving PHA kind of comes to an end. That tenant simply becomes a participant in that PHA, the receiving PHA's jurisdiction. And this might sound kind of weird, but in some cases, a receiving PHA can eventually become initial PHA. So give you an example. Let's say we have a family that moves from initial PHA's jurisdiction to a receiving PHA's jurisdiction. That receiving PHA absorbs that family. And then sometime later in the process, that family decides to move to yet another jurisdiction, or even possibly back to initial PHA's jurisdiction. Well, that receiving PHA in that particular case essentially becomes initial PHA. So just be aware that that term between initial and fluid PHA, depending on how the receiving PHA addresses the voucher, can be kind of fluid. So initial receiving PHA can eventually become initial PHA. Want to talk a little bit about administrative fees. HUD has some revised regulations that now provide that the initial PHA reimburses the receiving PHA the lesser of 80% of the initial PHA's ongoing administrative fee, or 100% of the receiving PHA's ongoing administrative fee for each program unit under HAP contract on the first day of the month, for which the receiving PHA is billing the initial PHA. This essentially means that it's either or. Before these regulations were updated, it was simply 80% of the initial PHA's ongoing administrative fee. So whatever is the lesser will be the amount that's used. Initial and receiving PHAs continue to have discretion to negotiate and agree to a different administrative fee amount. And an important comment about mid-month moves: if the effective date of the HAP is on a date other than the first of the month, the receiving PHA cannot bill for administrative fees for that month. This is essentially because administrative fees are based on the first day of the month. So if the first day of the month has passed, even though that family later leases up in that same month, that family does that the receiving PHA or the receiving PHA is not entitled to the administrative fee for that month. Want to cover some portability deadlines here. So in a billing arrangement, this is a situation in which the receiving PHA administers a voucher. Initial billing is due 90 days from expiration of the initial PHA voucher. 30 additional days if delayed billing is due to suspension of the voucher term. Okay, so we provide some leeway there. Initial payment is due 30 days from receipt of initial billing. Subsequent payments are due the 5th business day of the month. Change in billing amount, this is 10 business days from the effective date of the change. And of course, termination of billing arrangement, similarly, it is 10 business days from the effective date of termination. I'm going to cover just some miscellaneous provisions. Late billings. I can tell you I've received a lot of complaints about late billings through the years. The initial PHA is generally not required to honor initial billings that are not received by the initial billing deadline. A receiving PHA that failed to send the initial billing by the billing deadline is generally required to absorb the family into its own program unless the initial PHA is willing to accept the late submission. Okay. This is a big issue sometimes with PHAs, and I've seen some PHAs really squabble over this. Overleasing and shortfall. Initial PHAs may not terminate or delay making payments under existing billing arrangements as a result of overleasing or funding shortfalls in initial PHA's program. PHAs may only terminate HAP contracts to which they are party to address sufficient funding in accordance with the regulations. And finally, transfer of units and funding. This situation mainly occurs when the initial PHA fails to provide billing payments. At the request of the receiving PHA, HUD may transfer funds for assistance to portable families, may also transfer the initial PHA's ACC vouchers to the receiving PHA. Okay, so essentially what's happening is we have a initial PHA that is just simply not responding to billing statements from the initial the receiving PHA. The receiving PHA can request that HUD transfer either or both the funding and ACCs to the receiving PHA. I think this is kind of rare. It's not something that we do. It's not something that we like to do, but it is a remedy that we have if this situation takes place. Now, I threw in a slide about disaster assistance. Want to make a point that HUD does not provide any disaster assistance funding. Though such funding may be available through FEMA in case of a federally declared disaster. In some cases, there are other entities that might also provide disaster assistance or disaster housing assistance. PHAs who provide assistance to HCV families evacuating an affected area by disaster must either absorb or administer absorb the voucher. I think I may have stated this a little incorrectly, but the idea here is that if there's a disaster in another PHA's jurisdiction, and you're in the receiving PHA and you have a family that's coming from that jurisdiction, there are no special funds through HUD to assist that family. You would have to either administer or absorb that voucher. And of course, if you absorb that voucher, you have to make sure that you have the budget authority to support the family. PHAs may establish local preference to assist unassisted families affected by disaster. Now, this is not really technically a portability issue. This would be a situation in which, let's say you have a disaster occurs in another jurisdiction. Family does not have a voucher from there, comes to your jurisdiction. Um, if you have a local preference to assist families that have been affected by disaster, you can house that family ahead of others on the waiting list. I worked for HUD back in the time of the Katrina disaster in 2005, and one of the ways that we addressed that issue is that we encouraged our housing agencies and their boards to implement policies that called for a local preference. That made it a little easier for them to accept people affected by disaster. Do want to point out that we do have an email address. If you happen to have any questions about portability in a disaster situation, you can send an email message to disasterportability@hud.gov. I think there's somebody that will monitor that and might be able to provide you some guidance if you have a specific situation that you were trying to deal with. And want to cover just really quickly a few points about picking data entry. Normally, if we're talking about a resident, well, let me restate this. In the initial PHA's jurisdiction, the initial PHA is always going to issue a voucher issuance code. This is a code 10. It's not a full 5058. It's kind of a partial 5058 that captures some basic information for the family, okay? If the family was receiving assistance prior to porting, we're receiving assistance in initial PHA's jurisdiction, the initial PHA is going to have a 5058. And then when that family gets ready to move, again, the initial PHA will submit a voucher issuance or code 10. Now, normally when the family moves out, the initial PHA is also going to do a move out, which is, it's what we call a portable move out, code number 5. This is what signals the PIC system that a family is ported from the initial PHA's jurisdiction and will be moving to another jurisdiction. On the other end of that, the receiving PHA will also issue a voucher issuance or a code 10, and then later on we'll do a portability move-in. There is one specific circumstances in which this process gets changed around. So if you have a case in which you have a non-resident family that had an application on file at least 12 months prior to application, lived in that initial PHA's jurisdiction for at least 12 months, that family has the right to, I'm sorry, let me restate that. That family has the right to port right off the bat, okay? That family would not have already received assistance. So the initial PHA will not have issued a voucher issuance code or a, well, I think they will issue a voucher issuance code, but the receiving PHA in that case will have to do a new admission. There won't be a portability move out for them to do a subsequent portability move in. And I'm providing some general information. I hope that all of you have a copy of my slide. HUD has an overview of the portability process. And I've also included a page or a section out of the HCV guidebook on portability. These are both really excellent guides that provide some additional guidance on how the portability process works. And with that,